Okay, I am going to be sharing my thoughts and feelings on this book, The Tamarind Tree by Sundara Ramaswamy. Sundara Ramaswamy. So, first of all, this book is basically about a tamarind tree in a region of South India, and it just recounts a bunch of stories, and some are stories, some are more like controversies, leading up to the death of this tamarind tree. The death, that's a dramatic word, but it was dramatic, and I would call it a death. Spoiler, the tree was poisoned. Like, you can't get any more dramatic than that. But yeah, and I was really looking forward to this book because I've never read a book from South India before, and I felt like it would broaden my knowledge of the world, and it did. I learned a lot from this book. It talks a lot about politics and quite a bit about religion towards the end as well, and it really gives like a nice dive into like the lifestyle of people living around this tamarind tree. And what's interesting is that it's set in a place in southern India where there are more Christians and Muslims than Hindus, which is quite rare. So it has a pretty unique perspective on South India, in my opinion. Yeah. Anyways, while I thought this book was really interesting, and I truly did think I learned a lot from it, I really hated the way this book portrayed women. I actually really hated the way this book portrayed women. And I get it, it's set in 1960 something, so, or it was published in 1960 something, and it was written by a man, so I can't really say that I'm surprised, but it was just bad. It was bad. I'm gonna be talking about spoilers here, so if you want to read this book and stuff and you don't want to know what happens, then maybe don't watch this next part. But the first thing that was so mind-boggling was one of the first stories that is told is about this girl who, long story short, she commits suicide by the tamarind tree, and the narrator is describing her beautiful breasts as she is dead, and I was girl, she literally just committed suicide. Why are you thinking about her breasts? It actually made me want to gag, but I was okay, whatever, I'll just let it pass. But then there's another part where basically earlier in time, the tamarind tree also had a tamarind pond, but then a king came to that town, and then the pond smelled really bad, so the king was get rid of the pond, and so everyone worked really hard to drain the pond, and then the pond went from a pond to a park. And then in describing the livelihood that this park brought to its town, it started mentioning how women would go there to flirt with men, and the way it described women was just weird. It was their saris would fall off their shoulder, and they would reveal cleavage and shoulder to the men, and I was oh my god, why is it described so oddly? And maybe this is just me being sensitive, whatever, but I do feel it's very male gaze. I feel it could have been described in another way. You could have emphasized the livelihood that this park brought without doing all that. I felt there were actually two whole I feel it was a whole page just dedicated to talking about women flirting, and I was oh, that's not necessary. And then also every single woman mentioned in this book, for some reason she's always described with her body, and compared to the men in this book, every single man in this book has at least a 2-page backstory. What did they do as a child? How is their relationship with their parents? What their personality is how much money they had? All these things were to describe the men, right? But then to the woman, it was just she was ugly, she was hot, she was all right, she had nice figure, and it was just what? That's more than that. And then also women were no women were made to be important. Again, women were either just described for their body, or they were just described as just lifeless figures who did nothing. There's actually a sentence in this book where it's describing a period of political upheaval, and the sentence was women, instead of being bored in their house all days, they could just walk outside, or open their door and see all the political action, all of the stuff going on in town. And I was what? was frustrating. So, but that aside, I actually did find a lot of these stories to be interesting. If I just ignore like the part about that I just talked about, I really like how every single story, in one way or another, led back to the tamarind tree. Like, no matter how off topic I thought it was going, I was like, why are we talking about two men like feuding over cigarettes? It did lead back to the tamarind tree in some way or another. And I was like, oh, like that's like, it is really interesting to see, because one of the big questions that's being asked consistently in this book is like, why did the tamarind tree die? Or like, why was the tamarind tree cut down? And you can't answer that question simply. So this book goes through like all of the political nuances that led up to the death of the tamarind tree. And like, why did the tamarind tree die? You could answer it by, it was poisoned by mercury. Or you could answer it by like answer it with like this, you know? But it was a really interesting read. I keep saying that. I want to elaborate more. Let me talk about maybe some specific stories. Oh, okay, so let's talk about the death of the tamarind tree. I'd like to say, in short, it was because of these two people. I apologize if I'm saying their names wrong, but Damu and Kader, and they're basically like lifelong business rivals, right? And Damu has a business underneath the shade of the tamarind tree, and Kader and Damu are running against each other for an election. And something Kader wants to do is cut down the tamarind tree so that Damu's business will do badly and he will lose revenue. And it actually technically wasn't Kader's idea, but it is something that would ultimately help Kader in the election. So that's why he tried to poison or try to convince the government, like, let's get rid of this tree. But Damu, what he does is a little bit genius. He basically goes to like the government office, and he's like, who is Hindu here? And he convinces them that the tamarind tree is a goddess, that the tamarind tree is a deity, and it must be protected under all costs. And so that kind of manipulation, faith-based manipulation, is what allows him to gain more votes in favor of him. But, spoiler, Kader actually hires someone to poison the tamarind tree, which is what leads to his death, or the tamarind tree's death. But then at the same time, because the tamarind tree was now like seen as a deity, its death was not seen as favorable, and they were able to pinpoint it back to Kader, and he was then sentenced to prison. So, and then Damu was also, I actually forgot why, but he was also sentenced to prison. I feel like I should remember this better because I like low-key just read it, but I'm not gonna lie, by the end of the book I was like skimming through because I was like tired. It has a lot of good information, but there are a lot of details, and it gets tiring because it talks about politics so much, and there's so much to remember that I honestly like forgot a lot of it. Sorry, but I still liked it. Another story that I really liked was about, I think it was Kader. His rise to fame was quite an interesting story. It starts off by telling about his childhood, and it is described that he did not like his father. Kader's father, was very much like all about meditation and didn't really take care of his wife nor his family. So Kader was like, oh, like, how could you as a father like neglect such a beautiful wife and neglect your children? So Kader, growing up, he had to work really hard to like make a name for himself and get money. So he worked a bunch of part-time jobs, and he found a part-time job that he really liked, and he was pretty loyal to the shop. And the shop owner was very kind to him and treated him like a son. But he surprisingly decided to quit the job and work for another shop by an owner who was kind of infamous for being like reckless and not super smart and kind of cunning and mischievous. But he actually did that on purpose. Kader decided to basically take over this business by running it so well that the original owner couldn't take care of it anymore. And so by doing that, he was able to gain his own business and get his own shop to himself and make a lot of money. But one big thing is, in order to get a shop that he wanted, he had to deposit a large sum of money. And the original owner of that shop was like, okay, I'll give you the money, but you have to marry my daughter. And so he was like, all right, let me see your daughter. And he sees the daughter, and he's like, Kader's like, oh wow, she's ugly. And then he kind of falls into the same lifestyle that his father had. Like, he starts neglecting his wife. He starts to like let the fame get to his head, and he starts to like act arrogant and neglect familial duties and all these other things, right? And by the time we got to like that point of the story, I realized like, wow, like he's just becoming his father again. Like, isn't that so interesting how that worked out? Yeah, I feel like I'm talking about Kader a lot because he was like this half of the book. But in the description, I thought the main character was going to be this guy named Damodara Asan, and he's a master storyteller who told a lot of stories to the narrator, and the narrator just retells his stories, right? But I did really enjoy the stories that Damodara Asan told. He told the story about the girl who committed suicide by the tamarind tree, and he told the story about how the tamarind pond had to be drained because the king thought it smelled bad. And those were stories that were narrated in a very, very, very good way. However, he was only present for like a third of the book, like this much of the book. After a while, he was like gone, like he died, right? And then he was never mentioned again. And I thought he'd be more pivotal. I mean, he's the freaking front cover of the book, and he's mentioned like as a very important person in the summary. So I was kind of disappointed that like he wasn't as important as he was made out to be. But and I wish like literally after like the first third of the book, he's only mentioned like 3 other times, like in passing. So I was like, like where'd he go, huh? And that also was when like they really started talking about politics, and I wasn't able to see just yet when they started talking about politics how it led to the tamarind tree. So I was like, why are we talking about this? Like, why are we talking about this? But when you stick through, it all makes sense and it wraps up really nicely. So yeah, overall, I would rate this book a 6.5 out of 10, because the part about the woman really made me angry. 6.5 out of 10. Yeah, 6.5 out of 10. Lots of points for the knowledge it gave me, for the insight it gave me on life, politics, business, and southern India, and minus points for talking about the woman, and minus points for like just like I wanted more Damodara Asan. He was such a cool, interesting character. Like, he was described as someone really like enigmatic, and I was like, well, tell me more. But I guess that's part of his character. Like, you don't know much about him, and you never will. So I guess it's on brand. Okay, that is all. Thank you for watching / listening to me ramble. I would basically give this whole spiel to my sister, but she's applying for jobs right now. She's like doing something important and beneficial to the world. So I'll just talk to my phone and call it a day. Whoop-de-doo. Yay! Yay for books. Okay, bye-bye. Toodaloo.